I was in my early 20s when this happened. At the time, I lived in south central Oklahoma, on the outskirts of a small town called Duncan. I was helping a friend round up some cattle that had gotten loose because someone had run across a T-section and went through their fence. It tore 2 posts right out of the ground and left about a 30-foot section open for the cattle to escape. We had already found most of the cattle, but were missing another 3 or 4. So we were out at 1 a.m. on our dirt bikes, trying to find them before someone hit one and sued his father. My friend and I went east, and the other guys went north and south. One thing you need to understand about Oklahoma is that it's mostly farmland, either cattle or crops. It's also divided into 1-mile sections for the most part. In other words, all the roads run north and south or east and west, and intersect at 1-mile intervals. If you ask directions for something out in the country, you are more likely than not to get instructions that include, go 3 miles north and then 2 miles west. The area at this time was sparse, and there aren't many homes around there. We didn't know how long the hole had been in the fence. My friend's father only checked it because he noticed he was missing livestock. They owned the entire section, and a good portion of the adjoining section as well. The hole in the fence was on the east side of their land, at the furthest distance from their house. They checked the perimeter for any damages on a weekly basis, so the opening could not have been more than a couple of days old. James and I were riding on these old dusty roads on our dirt bikes with battery-powered spotlights to show the way. We would stop at any of the million small wooden bridges to see if there were any cows down by the water. Our plan was to go out 10 miles and then backtrack, scanning the area as we did. This was for all the roads that went north to south and east to west. If you were to plot it on a map, it would have been a 10 by 10 grid. We had been at this since 9 p.m. Just as it was getting dark, we had already gone 10 miles out and about 3 miles over. I need to mention at this point that there are some sections that are not divided by roads, and you have to turn one way or another at an intersection. If that happens, we always took the road that went in our general direction. We were traveling east when we came upon one of these intersections. We had already checked the roads going north of us. This particular area used to belong to an old farmer who had passed away some time ago and left his land to relatives who had no interest in farming. The property was put on the market and had been left alone for many years. I guess the asking price was too steep. As a result, these roads aren't used much, and nature had reclaimed them. Some of the pathways had major overgrowth, which made them difficult to navigate. Sometimes you're just left with little more than an improvised trail. We were heading south toward the next intersection, where we would have to turn east again. I know this might be confusing for some, but we were fanning out in a particular way to cover as much ground as possible. The land was very hilly and had not been used for farming in at least 30 years. We were both familiar with it, as we had been hunting and fishing here on occasion. We had just made the turn back east when we saw something burning in the distance, just over the hill. Grass fires are extremely dangerous and can get out of control within minutes, especially in this area where everything was dead. As we topped the hill, we saw that the fire was actually in the middle of the road. When we got to it, we found that it was a recliner that was burning. It looked like one of those lazy boy recliners engulfed in flame. We stopped and threw some dirt on it and finally got it extinguished. James and I were wondering what kind of idiot would do this, and how strange it was just to be sitting in the middle of the road. Satisfied that the fire was out, we got back on our bikes and idled past the recliner toward the end of the section. We found one of the cows at the bottom of the next hill, about 100 feet down the road. It was lying half in, half out of the road. Its throat had been slashed, and it was lying there with its eyes open and tongue hanging out. We were looking at it, trying to figure out what the hell happened. "Hey, look at this," James said, and showed me where the blood had dripped down from the cow to about 10 feet away from it. There were shoe prints of blood in the road, and we discovered that there were 3 sets total upon closer inspection. At this point, the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I suddenly felt a chill in the air. I looked at James. His eyes were as big as saucers. He thought something disturbing was happening out here as well. We talked about going back, but he knew his hard-ass father would shame us if we didn't at least look around to see if there was anything else. We finally decided to walk the bikes the rest of the way to the end, just in case there was someone there. We didn't want them to hear our engines or decapitate us while we were speeding down the road. I saw that in a Friday the 13th movie once. The end of this road was at the base of the last hill. We started heading up it, and once we got to the top, my heart was going about 200 miles an hour, and I had cotton mouth so bad it was impossible to swallow. Then we noticed that someone had stuck paper plates on the barbed wire fence that lined the road. They were all stuck to the top strand of wire on both sides. It began about 50 feet behind us and continued up and over the last hill. They were evenly spaced about 5 feet apart. As our gaze followed the row of paper plates, James suddenly said, "Look, there's another fire." And it was at that moment that I could smell something. It wasn't that normal, smoky smell. It was as though someone had added incense to it. I asked James if he could smell it too, and he confirmed. I told him that I didn't like this at all. I was okay with losing face in front of our friends if I felt it was warranted. And in this situation, I was ready to go. There was more than one person who brutally murdered a cow on the side of the road, fastened paper plates to barbed wire fencing, and had set fire to a recliner. I was getting some major Yellow King vibes from this, and I didn't want to end up in a true crime novel. James agreed, but we had to go see what was burning at this second fire before we left. We started up the hill again, and I was thinking with every step we took that we were going to be on a missing persons report after tonight. As we got to the top of the hill, one of the paper plates blew off the fence and skittered behind us, making us both jump. After we saw what it was, I started to laugh, but James shushed me and told me to listen. We heard voices. Once the bottom of the hill came into view, there was a group of about 10 people, all standing around another recliner that was burning. They had their backs to us, and they were passing around a big pitcher. From our vantage point, we couldn't actually see what was in the pitcher, but I had a funny feeling I knew exactly what it was. They would each take a mouthful and spit it into the fire. This went on until the pitcher was empty. The entire time, they were all saying something in unison. They changed their tones in a rhythmic manner, with an emphasis on the last word. I can remember hearing the phrase, "here and there," along with the words, "beseech," and "Father." James and I stood there like a couple of idiots, our mouths hanging wide open, literally scared stiff. There was a small table set up on the side. After the last of the liquid was gone, one of the men turned and sat the pitcher down on the table, then picked up what looked like a large loaf of bread. Just as he was turning back toward the fire, he spotted us. I'm sure we made nice silhouettes sitting there on top of the hill. He yelled and dropped the loaf of bread, then started running toward us. The others turned and immediately followed him. That was all the encouragement we needed to snap out of our trance. It was time to go. We turned our bikes around. James got his started on the first kick, but I somehow managed to get myself off balance. The bike fell on its side, with me on it. This time I was near having a panic attack and was breathing in short, raspy breaths. I picked the bike back up again and tried to start it, but it stalled out once again. I thought about just ditching it and running, but we were in the middle of nowhere. I finally started pushing the bike back down the hill, then jumped on it. It seemed like forever to get enough speed, but I popped the clutch and it finally started. James was waiting for me at the corner of the intersection to make sure I was coming. We headed directly back to his house, going way too fast, especially in the dark. When we finally got back to his place, we told his dad what he saw. Buster, James's father, then called a couple of his friends, and they all loaded up their trucks with enough weapons to start a small war. James and I sat with him and told him where to turn. Buster kept asking us questions on the way, like what they were doing. Why was the chair on fire? They cut the cow's throat? How many were there? What did they look like? And what were they driving? That last question stumped us. We hadn't actually seen any vehicles at all. The road that we were on was the only way in or out, and there was a creek that ran on the back side, so they couldn't have gone in any other direction. When we got to that last stretch of road, the headlights found the spot where the recliner had been sitting. It was gone. As we got closer, James noticed that the cow was gone as well. I hate to admit it, but I was becoming scared all over again. I was afraid that his dad would think that we were messing around and accuse us of wasting his time. Buster noticed the charred remains of the chair off in the ditch on the left side of the road. Then I noticed the dead cow on the other side. It was also in the ditch. The paper plates we saw mounted to the fences were all gone. Buster got out to look at the cow with the other men. They stood there talking and shaking their heads for what seemed like 10 minutes before getting back into their trucks. He continued toward the hill. The ruts in the dirt made by our bikes were easily seen, but there was no fire on the other side of the hill. We all went down to where the second recliner had been, but the table and all the people we saw were gone. You could see where someone had walked around the charred area and covered it with dirt. Upon returning, the county sheriff was called, and by that time it was daylight, and we went out again with the sheriff and deputy. When we got back to the road, the first recliner and the cow were now gone. Not moved, gone. But you could still see where something had been on fire, and there was still blood on the road and in the grass. James showed them the shoe prints we had seen. At the bottom of the hill, same story. You could still see the charred area where the second recliner had been, and the deputy found scuff marks where the table had been sitting. At the end of the road, you could see where the top strand of the fence had been tugged down and wrapped around the lower strand so someone could climb over it. You could also see where the grass and weeds had been trampled over, providing a fairly easy trail to follow. We found a woman's tennis shoe on the other side of the creek. We followed the trail all the way across the field, up to the next dirt road. Again, the top wire of the fence was wrapped around the next lower wire, and there was a piece of red bandana-looking material caught on one of the barbs. There were marks on the road where 2 or 3 different cars had spun their tires when they left. There was also a large piece of glass that had blood on it. We filed the report for the missing cow. They found 4 cows in the opposite direction from where James and I had gone, and the other guys didn't encounter the burning recliners. The sheriff called us back a few days later and told Buster that the blood on the glass was human and not bovine. It was his guess that the glass pitcher broke and someone had cut their hand on it while carrying it back to their vehicles. 2 weeks after that, there was a huge scare in our community about some cult that were claiming that they were going to sacrifice a blonde-haired virgin girl and boy. Buster always said that this was just someone running their mouth after hearing about our incident. It was all anyone was talking about during that summer. He also said that he would sure like to know what happened to that cow.
This happened to me just a few years ago while I was still in college during the winter break. If there ever was a break for me during college, I would usually just drive back to my hometown, where my parents lived, so I could spend some time with them. It was a pretty long drive, but I didn't want to end up getting a motel as they're always really creepy and dirty. And the last time I stayed in one, junkies broke into my car. If possible, I usually don't stop for anything other than gas while driving long distances. But on that night, during the winter break, I succumbed. I was cruising along the highway that night when I found myself getting a little drowsy. It even got to the point where I was catching myself dozing off. To me, driving when you haven't slept is the same as driving drunk, so I decided not to take the risk. At the point where I was on the highway, I knew there wasn't a motel for a good few miles. So instead of taking time to find one, I pulled into a deserted rest stop off the highway to get some rest. The rest stop was right next to some forest, and it even had an outhouse. I let out a sigh of relief as I had been holding in a dump for almost the entire trip. I shut off the car and climbed out into the cold air. I approached the outhouse and stepped inside and locked the door. Under normal circumstances, I would have never even considered using a dirty porta-john off the side of a highway, but I was pretty desperate, and I knew I would sleep much more comfortably if I dropped the weight before doing so. As I sat there, all I could hear was the sound of the trees blowing in the soft, winter breeze, sending a chill through my whole body. Just after that was when I first heard it. The sound of slow footsteps thumping around in the woods behind me, and also what sounded like heavy breathing. I froze, trying to stay as quiet as I could, listening to the person wander around. I must have sat there for 10 minutes, just listening. It didn't sound like they were going away. Eventually, the person started to get closer to the outhouse, moving around it until they were right beside the door. I was then startled by 5 hard punches on the door, which shook the entire little building. I immediately began to finish up and assumed the person just wanted to use the bathroom. That was when I began to wonder what someone would be doing in the forest next to a deserted highway at this time of night. As I finished and yanked my pants up, the porta-john began to shake violently as the person outside began to pull on the door, as if their life depended on it. I decided to call out to them. 1 second! Nothing changed. The door continued to shake like crazy for another 30 seconds, and then stopped suddenly. I then heard them walk back around to the other side. With my heart racing, I cautiously unlocked the door, planning to make a run to my car. I shoved the door open and nearly fell over as I stumbled out, and I bolted to the driver's side of my car, jumping in and starting it. I turned my head and looked out the passenger side to see the face of a crazed man pressed up against the window. He had a wide, toothy grin, and eyes wider than the fucking moon. He slammed his hands against the glass, shrieking with maniacal laughter. I yelled at him, "What the fuck do you want?" He then reached down and tried to open the passenger door. With that, I threw the car into drive and sped out of the rest stop. Swerving onto the highway, I looked in the rearview mirror to see him standing underneath the one lamppost, watching me drive away. I kept driving, speeding down the highway, not stopping for anything. After about 45 minutes, I decided to pull into a gas station and take a short break and calm down a little. Things like that are precisely why I don't stop to sleep on a long trip. It's been a few years now, but the images of that crazed man's face is still lingering in my mind. I'm still wondering what that man might have done to me had he gotten that door open.
At the time of this story, I was a freshman in college. I'm also a very introverted person, and have only made a few friends throughout my time in college, maybe 3 or 4. Also, at the time, I had a bit of a fishing phase, where I loved fishing. I still do, but at the time, I loved to almost every day. I only really fished the common freshwater fish, bass, sunnies, a few catfish, etc. But I was looking to go for something bigger. I was hoping to catch some carp. My college campus does have a lake and does stock it for students to fish. My school isn't near a gas station or a shopping center or anything of the sort, so I couldn't just go walk to get fishing supplies. And I didn't have a car, so I was really only dependent on what I brought from home. Carp are also very sloppy fish, so they will just eat straight up food. Anything that can produce a pungent odor, I would just get some food from the dining hall, and whatever I didn't finish, I would fish with. Carp also prefer wet, sticky, rainy, or overcast weather, and are more active during the darker parts of the day. So, one day, I sat in my room bored until around 6:30 or 7, and I started to hear rain outside. I didn't immediately go straight to fishing. I went to the dining hall at dinner and came back with leftovers to retrieve my rain jacket, boots, and fishing gear. I was taking my time, so by the time I arrived at the lake, it was about 8. Now, this lake is a pretty modest size. You could see probably 90% of it, regardless of where you stand. 3/4 of it is bare grass, with a walking path, while the remaining bit is trees and other brush. I stood on a bank and threw my line in the water. I leaned against a tree, but I couldn't look at my phone because it was raining. So my attention was focused on my line, until something else caught it. I spotted this person, or at least what I assumed to be a person, right on the outer edge of where the trees and brush began. It was a rainy night, and the streetlights didn't stretch to where they were, so take what I say with a grain of salt. But they seemed to be wearing white pants, a big black sweatshirt, and no shoes, just what appeared to be socks. They were standing in a very marshy, swampy area as well. If they weren't already getting completely soaked from the rain, they'd be getting soaked from the feet up with mud. They also had what seemed to be a small black box with white light coming out of it. The light seemed to pierce through the night. It was insanely bright, even though it was very small. I'd say palm-sized. The amount of power it had was incredible. They would walk back and forth from the edge of the lake, look at the lake, and skip or dance back behind a tree, all the while picking up this small cube and pointing the light in the direction of different areas, going back behind the tree, revealing at the lake's edge, skip back behind, reveal themselves to move the box, go back behind the tree, and then do it all over again. I watched them do this multiple times. At this point, I was more interested in them than my fishing. It wasn't until they went back behind a tree, this time walking slowly, then stayed behind it for an uncomfortable amount of time, and walked out slowly to the lake's edge, and like they had a sixth sense, just turned and looked directly at me. From the only light emanating on them, I could only see this metallic, shiny, silvery sheath covering their face. It was featureless, with no holes cut out for eyes or mouth. They stood there, like they were staring into my soul for about 30 seconds. I didn't look away. I don't even think I blinked. And then they turned, and I saw them walk into the brush, leaving the small cube on the ground. And at this point, I had had enough. I packed up everything quickly, and as I was walking back toward my dorm, I heard manic footsteps, very much barefoot slaps on the tarmac path. I took off running back to the staircase, leading back to the main campus, but not without looking down the foot trail. I took my final look at the figure, and they were sprinting in the opposite direction with their arms up in the air, not making any noise. I got back to my dorm safe and sound. Nothing happened for the rest of the night, but I returned to the lake early the next morning before my classes, and found what appeared to be hoof prints, though very exaggerated points on the top, and the shape of a bloated V. Normally, I would say this might have been some drunk or high student, But that doesn't explain their extremely weird behavior. Those weird footprints in the drying mud, or that shiny face that pierced my soul. I'm not sure what I meant that night, but I'm not sure I even want to know.
It was a beautiful late summer's day. The weather had finally started to cool as fall approached, and Sam wanted to take advantage of it. He figured the best way to go about that was a short camping trip. It was already midday, so he quickly gathered the essential supplies needed for at least a day of camping and was off to the store for the rest of the important supplies. He was in a rush. Sam was quickly losing light and wanted to find a place to camp before it got dark. Usually, being the experienced camper that he is, his trips are planned in advance. Every supply and every detail exact. Also, letting friends and loved ones know where he's going to be, just in case of an emergency. This being a spur-of-the-moment decision, and him being in such a rush, trying to get everything, and trying to get there, and have everything set up before the sunset, he wasn't able to call anyone to let them know where he was going to be. It completely slipped his mind. When he did finally think of it, he was in line at the store, trying to check out. He knew it was important, but told himself he could do it when he got settled at the campsite. For how late in the day it was when he made his decision to go, he still made great time and got everything set up and was all settled in before the sunset. After setting up the tent and getting the fire started, he laid back and rested his head against a log he had placed down the last time he was here and stared up at the sky, watching the sun set over the mountains. He was at peace. This was his favorite spot. He had been here so many times before, it was like a second home to him. And nobody knew about this place but him. It was secluded, just off the main hiking trail. When the sun completely set behind the mountaintops, and it was dark, Sam was ready for dinner. He brought out the cast iron skillet and placed it on top of the simmering coals and cooked up a couple of steaks. He also remembered to call a few people to let them know where he was, but he couldn't get through to anyone. There was no signal. He laughed it off and said to himself, "It's no big deal. I'm only staying overnight. What's the worst that could happen?" He then finished cooking the steaks and couldn't wait to dig in. They smelled delicious, and at this point he was starving. He sat by the fire and enjoyed the meal he had cooked, savoring every bite that he took. "The best steak I have ever cooked," he thought. The wind began to pick up as he enjoyed his meal, that hollow, eerie, peaceful sound that the wind makes, heard in the distance. He closed his eyes and relaxed, enjoying the last bites of his meal. He thought he heard something off in the distance, however. Probably an animal, or maybe it was the wind playing tricks with his ears. He wasn't alarmed. It couldn't be anything other than those two things. And I'm not afraid of those two things, he thought. A rifle, which he had brought for protection, will put a person's mind at ease after all. He then cleaned up after himself, the utensils and the skillet, whistling as he did so. Still, though, he swore he could hear sounds off in the distance. When he finished cleaning, he laid back down by the fire and stared up at the starry night sky. The wind really picking up at this point. Sam thought it was peaceful and made him relax even more. He felt himself beginning to doze off, but was awoken by a moaning sound in the distance. He sat up and looked around, but saw nothing. Now, while, yes, he thought it was a strange sound, it could have easily just been a hurt animal. At least that's what he told himself. He was not worried at all, however. He had the rifle, remember? He decided it was time for bed and got up and headed inside the tent. He fell asleep right when his head hit the pillow. It had been a long, hectic day, but ended in his favorite place to relax. He had been asleep maybe an hour when he was awoken again by moans off in the distance. They were ominous, and as he sat up, it sounded as if they were getting closer. The wind was at full-blown howl at this point, but the moans were cutting through it like a knife. These were no animal sounds that he had ever heard of before. He was starting to get a little nervous at this point. The moans were getting louder, and they were getting closer. Sam grabbed his rifle and placed it in his lap. The wind seemed to have picked up even more and had begun to shake the tent a little. Still, through the sound of the leaves blowing violently in the wind, the sounds of moaning were getting closer. It sounded like someone was dying. Long, painful moans, like they were moments away from death. Now, the moaning sounded like it was at the log by the campfire. Sam quickly readied the rifle in a firing position and screamed out, "Don't come any closer! I have a gun!" It was silent. The moaning had stopped. All that could be heard was the hollow wind blowing around him. A few moments pass. Still silence. Sam has his rifle fixed at the opening of the tent, when right outside the tent, right next to his ear, a soft, deathly moan moans his name. He screams out and the tent begins to rattle and shake. Loud moans now ring all around him. They are deafening. They keep moaning his name. He's screaming for them to stop, for them to leave or he'll shoot. All of a sudden, the opening of the tent begins to unzip. Then a loud, ominous moan screams out,
"You're mine."
Sam screams, "No! Get away!" And a gunshot rings out into the night. When the sun rose the next morning, the sounds of birds chirping and the soft, gentle breeze that blew through the leaves could be heard as the park rangers came upon the campsite. There was a report of shots fired by some campers who were camped not far from where Sam was camped overnight. Sam's campsite was so secluded, however, and not in a designated camping area. The rangers only found it from the smoke billowing from the embers of the now dying fire. The rangers made their presence known and asked for the occupants of the tent to come out, but they got no response. Then one of the rangers reached for the zipper and unzipped the opening to the tent. They couldn't believe their eyes. The entire inside of the tent was covered in blood, and a broken rifle laid in the back left corner. There was no signs of a struggle, no rips or tears in the tent, and no footprints around the campsite. It seemed as if no one had been here at all. The only signs of Sam were his belongings.
We were looking for a place to party that Halloween night. We hadn't had a problem before because one of us would have a girlfriend that was babysitting. Yeah, cliché, I know. But this fall, none of us were dating any girls that were working babysitting jobs. So my 3 best friends and I were not sure what we were going to do. However, my friend Aaron knew about an old farmhouse he was pretty sure had been abandoned for a long time. Apparently he had scoped it out a few days before and was sure that there was no one there. So on Halloween night, we got some beer and decided to break into the place. I didn't know what to expect when I was coming up upon the place, but we had to walk since it was over a stretch of farmland that had since grown over. It was a pain carrying the beer with us all that way, but it wasn't like we had to bring the bottles back. The house was pretty creepy, but that just made it perfect for Halloween. We easily broke into the place and got prepared to have a really good night. As we were drinking and smoking, another of my friends, Chris, didn't seem like he was having the best time. He looked preoccupied, but he wouldn't tell us why. It really wasn't until much later in the night that he finally opened up and told me what was bothering him. He claimed that he had heard some noises and thought that there might be someone else in the house with us. We had been there for a couple hours already, so I just thought this was ridiculous. The house was obviously abandoned, and if some hobo lived there or something, there would have been some sign of them. Hell, in fact, they wouldn't just leave us partying there in their squatter's palace. They would have come to chase us out or something. But pointing all this out to Chris really didn't do any good. He still seemed nervous, and he just wouldn't loosen up and enjoy himself. Still, nothing happened for the next several hours, and I know that I didn't hear anyone else in the house. Of course, with the drinking and smoking, things eventually got a little blurry as the night went on. We had stayed up pretty late and figured we would just leave in the morning. All of us would have gotten into major trouble if we went home drunk and stoned. Luckily, the house was dry and not uncomfortable. I did come to later at night, but I wasn't sure how late it was. It was quiet and dark in the house, so I figured that my friends must have gone to sleep or passed out too. I did find that I had to go to the bathroom though, and I knew I'd have to go outside. There were indoor bathrooms, but we had discovered earlier in the night that they were too gross for even us to use. It was dark outside, but as I was coming back in, it was worse because my eyes hadn't adjusted yet. I didn't want to stumble and fall over anyone, so I took my phone out and flipped it open. This was in the early 2000s, so phones didn't have flashlights on them yet. I had to use the light from the screen to see my way around. Those really didn't use much light though, so everything was still pretty dark. Then I heard a weird little noise. I don't know what I can compare it to, but it was enough to get my attention turned to a specific corner in the room. When I did, by the feeble light of the cell phone screen, I could make out someone who looked like Aaron laying back in the corner, and there was someone right over him. At first I assumed it was another one of my friends, but as I quickly shined the light around the room, I saw the other two at other parts of the room. So whoever was hovering over Aaron was a new person. I shined the phone back over there as I heard some more noise. It was just in time to see someone move away from Aaron and back into the hallway through a close-by door. I had thought that Aaron had been sleeping, but he woke up when I shined the light back, and he had seen someone standing over him. He confirmed it pretty quickly by how scared he was, and I knew that I hadn't just had my eyes playing tricks on me. We got the other guys up and told them what happened, but they didn't believe us at first. However, Aaron was so terrified, and he wasn't one to get very scared. We were all too messed up, and it was too dark for us to leave, so we remained in the house until the sun came up. The whole night, we heard someone moving around down in the basement, and we didn't get a wink of sleep as we slowly sobered up over the night. We got out of there at first light.
Growing up in Arizona, myths and legends are just a part of life. Native traditions, mystic places, vortexes, UFO abductions, and dozens of other stories of the unknown that I always found fascinating. I grew up spending a lot of time wandering around the desert and the mountains, hunting and camping, so I felt very at home in the wilderness. One late spring day, on one of my many hiking adventures, I wandered off trail and, after several hours, came upon a small group of old mud adobe houses. A few people heard me coming and came out of the houses to investigate. And after apparently making the collective decision that I was not a threat, one of the elders, dressed in an old-style traditional native clothing and in headdress, came over to greet me. The man spoke slowly and told me that I had wandered onto a Navajo reservation, and asked me if I was lost, or if I needed any help. When I told him no, I wasn't lost, but I intentionally had went off the trail, he chuckled and invited me in to eat with his family. The next several hours were one of the greatest experiences of my life. The whole thing was like being thrown back in time. While we ate and talked, others from the surrounding houses began coming over to join us, and I got the feeling they didn't get many outside visitors here. We shared stories for hours about life, family, their history in the area, and time spent in the wild. And the longer we talked, the more they opened up and the more interesting the elders' stories got. Throughout the time, there was one man who never spoke. He just sat out of the circle, listening and watching me. At one point, I told them I did what I called my walkabouts every year around September, where I would go out by myself into the wilderness for 2 to 4 weeks at a time. And this finally got the attention of the one silent old man. When I finished, he came over to the circle around the fire, sat directly on the ground in front of me, and asked me to join him on the ground. He told me that years ago he used to do the same thing, and went on to tell me about the canyon he went to. He described it as a dangerous but magical place, and that I would see the world differently if I came back. That must be just for dramatic effect, I thought. When he finished, he invited me over to his home. The house was small, and through an open door in the back room I could see it was filled with various animal pelts, coyotes and wolves mostly. He walked over and closed that door, then picked up and handed me an old map, and some written directions that seemed like he had been holding on to them for a very long time. Then he walked into the back room and closed the door behind him. It was late, and one of the families had invited me to stay the night, which I gladly did. The next morning, as I prepared to leave, one of the older women came over to me with something in her hands. She handed me a talisman and simply said, "Dip your bullets in the white ash at the hottest parts of the fire," then just walked away. September came, and as I packed for my walkabout, I saw the talisman in a drawer, and something felt right about taking it with me. After a beautiful drive, I was very happy to find the Forest Service road marked on the old map. The entrance to the area was remote and overgrown, and tough to get in even in my Jeep, and took me much longer to get to than expected, so I decided to make camp and start the hike in the morning. After a few hours on a trail that looked like it had been forgotten, I came upon a stream, and the entrance to the secret valley. It was a narrow crack in the tall cliffs, with about 4 feet of water running gently through, but too narrow for a kayak or canoe. I hoisted my gear over my head and began the wade sideways through chest-deep water. The crack in the cliff seemed to go on forever, but after almost 2 hours I came to the place where it opened up into a small lake in an incredible valley surrounded by tall rock faces. This may have been the most remote place I have ever been, in the sense that there was no sign that people had ever been there. No trash, no bullet casings, not even the evidence of campfires. My first night there was the quietest night I have ever spent in the wild. No birds, no frogs, not even crickets. But I didn't feel like I was alone there. In the morning after breakfast, I headed out on my first exploratory hike to explore my new home for the next couple of weeks. After being stalked by a mountain lion on a hike about 10 years ago, I make a point now of bringing a pistol with me when I'm out in the wilderness. After some looking around, I found a narrow path that appeared to be a game trail that led up the side of one of the cliffs, and what looked like caves from the canyon floor. I made my way up to them and came upon an entrance that was much larger than it appeared from below. I made some noise to alert any possible animals I was there, and made my way inside. The cave was an expansive single chamber that went back a couple 100 feet. As I walked, I inspected as much as I could see with my light, but there were no tracks of any kind in the dirt besides mine. So I decided I was alone in there and pushed forward on towards the rear of the cave. As I came around the last bend in the cave and approached the end, my headlamp panned across a large pile of bones. Some animal, some human, and all were very old looking. And there was a small candle sitting on a natural stone shelf. This is the first thing that has scared me in a long time as I can remember. But focusing my wits, I remembered that there was no other tracks in the cave, and figured it was all from a long time ago. I was still a little uneasy as I exited the cave, and was ready to get back to camp. As I came out into the light, about 75 feet away, there was the largest wolf I have ever seen, that looked like it was coming down from standing on its hind legs. It dropped down to all fours on a rock and just began staring at me. Not growling or baring its teeth, just staring. I pulled my .45 and fired 2 shots off to the side of it to scare it away. But it didn't even flinch. Not only have I never seen a wolf in this part of northern Arizona, but I have never seen a wild animal that did not at least flinch at the sound of a gunshot. We both stood there staring at each other for a moment. I turned and sat my backpack down to grab my binoculars and get a closer look. But when I turned back, the wolf had vanished. I made my way very cautiously down the path and back towards my camp. I have encountered wolves before, and usually it's not the one wolf you see that you should worry about. It's the ones you can't see. So I was extra cautious for the rest of the trip back to my camp. When I arrived, I made sure my gun was fully loaded, and got my recurve bow strung, just in case the wolves came back. I have seen plenty of predatory animals on my adventures. It's a part of being in the wilderness, so I wasn't too worried. Just prepared myself the best I could and went over to the lake to go fishing. Within about 20 minutes, I caught 2 of the biggest brown trout I have ever caught, so I decided to stop fishing for the day and take a swim. After, back at camp, I made a fire, cleaned my trout, and made dinner while the sun went down. As soon as the sun went down, all of the life in the canyon seemed to go quiet. As I put out my fire and prepared for bed, I noticed there was a small flicker of light coming from the area where the cave was located that I had explored earlier. It was a moonless night and stars don't reflect that way. It couldn't have been the candle I had seen. It was too old and would not have burned so bright. I decided to keep my gun close and try to get some sleep. I would investigate that cave some more the next day. When I woke at sunrise, there was a haze along the ground throughout the whole canyon floor. But as the sun rose, it disappeared quickly, and the area came back to life. I made my breakfast, gathered my gun and bow, and headed back up towards the cave. When I reached the entrance, I saw that there was no tracks besides mine around the entrance. Just a little further up, I came upon the entrance to another cave, much smaller than the first one. There was a small flat landing with a large, heavily twisted juniper tree that, to my absolute surprise, had many small objects hanging from thin, old-looking ropes tied to its branches. There were bones, but there were also old things definitely made by humans, and looked like they were old Native American artifacts. Thinking I might have found the spot where the old man I met on the reservation had stayed, I went into the cave. This cave was much different from the first one. Just a few feet in, I noticed the walls were covered in what looked like ceremonial cave paintings. As I pushed further back, the cave got dramatically colder. Much colder than it should have been, and the walls were completely covered with the paintings the entire way. When I reached the back of the cave, I was not prepared for what I saw. There was what looked like an old altar, made of wood and bones. As I looked around, I saw that a little before the back of the cave, there was another shaft in the ceiling that went up. And on a ledge about 20 feet up sat the small figure of what appeared to be a woman. She was small and pale, with her face painted white, and wearing something like a crown made of woven branches, with 2 small antlers at the front. I stopped and stared for a few minutes, and the figure did not move, so I assumed that it was mummified remains from a long time ago. Not wanting to disturb a burial site, I turned to walk back out of the cave. But as I began to walk, I heard what sounded like a faint voice in an unknown ancient language. I instinctively looked back up towards the figure, but it was gone. I was immediately terrified, and ran from the cave as fast as I could, but my headlamp flickered and died. I finally made my way out, feeling along the wall to find my way, and the whole way I felt like there was something right behind me. When I saw the first light from the cave entrance, I began to sprint towards it. But just before I made it out, I looked back, and there was nothing, so I slowed down. But I could still hear the faint voice, and the volume had never changed. When I got outside, all the bones and artifacts hanging from the tree were gone. I ran down the path as fast as I could, headed back to my campsite by the lake. Just as I reached the floor of the canyon, I noticed a large wolf at the tree line to my left. But this time it stayed standing upright on its hind legs. I stopped running, hoping to not initiate its predatory response to chase me. And again, it just stood there staring at me. I reached my campsite safely and immediately began packing up. It was too late in the day to make it out before dark, and I did not want to make the hike out at night with all that was going on. I moved my tent so it would back up to the canyon wall by the crack in the cliffside, so I didn't have to worry about anything sneaking up on me. I built my fire much larger, and I knew I wasn't going to be able to get any sleep that night. Just as the sun was going down, I began to hear noises coming from the trees, and I felt like I was being hunted. Finally, in the last light of day, I saw the wolf slowly walking around by where the path led out to the trees, and it began to slowly walk towards me. This time I drew my gun and fired towards the creature, intending to hit it. And while I saw a couple hit the dirt around it, several bullets did make impact. Several rounds from a .45 caliber will at least slow down anything I've ever encountered. But this giant wolf kept walking towards me like nothing had even happened. I continued to fire at it until the inevitable click of an empty magazine. I reached down and fumbled around in my backpack looking for my other magazines to reload. And as I lifted it, the talisman the old woman gave me fell out into the ground. I picked it up and put it around my neck and immediately remembered what she had told me. Dip your bullets in the white ash. As I looked around, I couldn't find my backup magazines, so I grabbed my bow, pulled an arrow that was tipped with a hunting broadhead and dipped it into the white ashes, drew and fired. I hit the creature just in front of its right hip, and it let out a noise, somewhere between a growl and a person screaming that made my blood curdle. I can hear that noise in my head even to this day. It immediately turned and ran back to the trees, and in the flicker of the firelight I saw the small woman with the antler crown, standing there waiting for it. They both retreated into the trees, and for the rest of the night I could hear the same faint voice I had heard in the cave. I spent the whole night outside of my tent, as awake as I've ever been, but no longer afraid. And at dawn I finished packing up so I could get out of that canyon. The next spring I went back to the small group of houses on the Navajo reservation. I was wearing the talisman as a necklace, and the first person to greet me was the woman who had given it to me, and she ran up to give me a big hug. "You heard me," was all she said. I asked the group about the man who had given me the map, as I was very desperate to talk to him about the experience I had, to see if I could compare it to his own. They told me he had disappeared shortly after I'd visited them, and he had not been back since. Strangely, when I tried to tell them what had happened to me, no one would let me tell the story. We all once again sat and shared other stories of life and a meal. Before I left the next morning, I found the old woman who had given me the talisman and offered it back to her. She smiled and told me I had a good heart, then just closed my hands around it, telling me to keep it to watch over my next walkabout. I went back to that small village on the reservation several times over the next 10 years or so, till I moved to Oregon, but they never let me tell them what had happened to me. I never went back to that canyon, and while curiosity sometimes gets the best of me, I don't think I ever will.
I don't know why I decided to browse inside the local thrift store. The idea of walking through aisles of pre-used items, possibly owned by deceased people, was always weirdly unsettling to me. The thought of an angry spirit clinging to whatever forgotten treasure was always a fear of mine. What if they desired revenge, seeking out the person who stole their treasured item from them? You could say I watched too many movies or TV shows. There was also a fear of bedbugs or whatever parasites, lingering, hidden inside the cracks unseen, that I'd end up bringing home with me. Who knows what filthy, hoarding houses these items were in before they ended up at the store. Putting aside my paranoia, I stepped through the entryway of a glass door with an open sign. I heard the automatic bell ring and walked through the mostly deserted building, greeted by the musty smell of old clothing, books and furniture. There were some people browsing the homewares or the long racks of clothing. I didn't have any specific item I was on the lookout for, but I had seen on TikTok that some people had picked up some bargains they were able to resell for a decent amount of money. So I decided I would try it out. Walking down the nearest aisles, browsing the stuff likely donated from some deceased grandma's estate. I absent-mindedly scratched my forearms, wondering who else touched these items, and trying to keep my imagination under control. Halloween was right around the corner. Tonight, in fact. There were old ornaments made of pumpkins, old witches' hats, and items that had seen better days. There were some copyright-compliant ones. A Batman with a mask, Wondrous Woman, and many others. Everyone knew who they were. After taking a few more steps, I saw their collection of Halloween masks all hang up on the rack. I saw clowns, politicians. In some cases, they were the same person. When I saw a creepy, old-school Halloween mask, I couldn't tell if it was a clown or some kind of sadistic killer. There was no way it was new. 90s? 80s? Maybe even earlier. Picking up the distorted mask by the coarse hair. It smelled rotten. Old plastic mixed with something else. Leather? I think it was. And a strong aroma of disinfectant. It was a putrid combination. The paint was flaking off, revealing a tan with an occasional brown bump. I figured it was a bit of mold, given how old it must have been. So it was difficult to tell what it originally looked like. The hair was old, 2 colors coming from a single point, and despite being disgusting, I couldn't look away from it. Yuck! Who the hell would want something like this? I said out loud to myself, turning it over and checking the price tag. There was none by the company who made it, sewn into the seams. just a thrift one hanging off it. It was only $10. Not too expensive, and I could use it to horrify my friends when they came over. While I'd never wear it, it would make the perfect Halloween decoration. Wishing I grabbed a shopping cart or a basket so I could put it down. Instead, I settled on holding it with my fingertips and wrinkling my nose in disgust. Wasting no time, I walked over to the registers while the two volunteer sales clerks were talking, handing it to the woman who tapped the price into the register and placed it inside a well-worn plastic bag. The elderly cashier woman raised a heavy eyebrow at me, accepted my cash, and handed me the bag, holding it and saying goodbye, thankful to no longer touch it, and helped myself to a generous amount of their hand sanitizer, provided free of charge, leaving the building with a bell as a warning and walking home. Every second or so step, my eyes dipped down, feeling uneasy about bringing it back home with me. It wasn't even nighttime. Still was sunlight outside, and there were children walking around with their Halloween costumes on. I saw the usual: witches, ghosts, various popular characters from the media. Fortunately, I stocked up on my treats. However, I was unwilling to share them with the neighborhood children and teenagers. I decided to do something a bit different this year. Instead of carving a pumpkin and placing it outside with a bowl of candy, ready for any greedy hands to take them, I decided to scare anyone who dared come to my front door, taking a hammer and a long single nail from the garage. I figured eye level would do the trick, finding a nice thick knot, and it caused the rest to hang down, lifeless and creepy. I debated adding another nail to stretch it out, in order to make it look extra creepy, but I decided to go with a minimal look. I drove the nail into the wood. It was loud, and after 2 hits, it was up. Standing back and admiring my handiwork, with my arms folded across my chest. At a distance, it could certainly pass for a real human face. Standing 2 meters back on the edge of the stairs, marveling at my work, and deciding it needed just something else. Remembering back to my old trick-or-treating days, hurrying inside and rushing up the stairs to the 2nd level, heading straight to my closet and going through my old costume items, leaving nothing but cluttered piles on the floor in my bedroom, until I finally found the box of old stage makeup. Most of the makeup had hardened, lipsticks turning to mere powder, and everything was unusable, with only the bottle of fake blood remaining, crusty around the top. Shaking it to discover it was still liquidy. Opening it, it looked perfect. Jogging back out to the front door, dribbling the blood down along the hairline, and standing back to see. It looked creepy. Twisting my head to one side, pondering where else the blood should go. Deciding around the eye sockets, creating bloody tears down the cheeks, and allowing it to flow down naturally. The fake, fresh blood weirdly began to bring it back to life. The pink gave it a weirdly human appearance. It was unsettling and perfect. I wondered which company made it. It was probably used as a prop in some B-grade horror movie. It still needed something else. I added blood around the twisted lips, around where the tear ducts were, and allowed it to leak down, anywhere a corpse would realistically bleed from. There was a smooth cut line around the neck. Actually, On closer inspection, it looked burnt, deciding to start ripping the edges to create more of a horror, grotesque appearance, as though a killer pulled someone's face right off. And finally, adding fake blood around the neck, pouring on half the bottle, it dribbled down onto the floor beneath, pooling around the door and staining the welcome mat. It was gory and magnificent. I couldn't resist a laugh of wicked glee. Dipping my finger inside the fake blood, I wrote, "I'll be back," just below the mask, all messy and disorganized, the way I imagined a deranged killer would, smothering my hand in the rest of the blood, planting it on the door, leaving a handprint, and smudged it down, leaving a trail as though a helpless victim had been dragged away. Happy with my work, I opened the door and went inside to wash it off, going inside and washing my hands many times, scrubbing with hot water and liquid soap to wash it off. I wondered how many kids would walk past, how many parents would complain to the city council that I had gone too far with my decoration. My security camera recorded footage, so I could always check out people's reactions tomorrow. I wondered if I'd get anyone checking in on me to see if I was okay. Maybe the police would be called. My imagination ran wild with the possibilities. Then I remembered how in the US, a corpse was found hanging from a tree among other decorations, only to still be up days later, while all the others had been taken down, and people believed it was a good prop, until they discovered that it was, at one point, an actual person. It was getting dark now, and I decided to grab some dinner, getting a microwave meal out of the freezer. It was some kind of tasty processed slop, and after stabbing the lid with a fork, I put it in the microwave, pouring a nice cup of hot chocolate, stirring the spoon, and taking a long, deep sip, leaning on the kitchen counter while the countdown took place, wishing at the last minute I got more into the spirit of Halloween. The loud ding filled the room. Lifting it out, opening the plastic wrapper, and the steam rising up while I tossed it on a tray. Taking a seat on the TV on my reclining sofa, settling in and making myself comfortable. A tray on my lap, the remote on my armrest, and turning on some trashy slasher film, my absolute favorite genre. Watching while some idiot was getting knifed by a serial killer and laughed, finding comfort in the predictable chaos it brought. I could hear the movie still playing, with the local kids making noise outside. My eyelids grew heavy, and soon I fell asleep. I don't know why I woke up. There was no noise. It was dawn. The early sunlight shining in. Staring down at me was a masked face, and taking a sharp, inward breath when I realized there was an intruder in the house with me. How the hell did he get inside? Wearing a balaclava, I couldn't see his face, but my focus was on the long knife he pointed at me. Why couldn't I move? I couldn't scream. Only a rasp came out. I could feel the knife fillet under my skin. While I couldn't make a sound, I was screaming inside, hoping someone would come and save me. Staring up at him, all I could see were his eyes. They showed no emotion. Cold. Lifeless. An efficient killer. I could feel every single movement of the blade under my skin. My fingernails clung deep into the armchair, the only action I could take. My phone was in my bag on the couch, and too far to reach. If I was able to turn my head, I'd be able to see it. With half my face folded down, covering my mouth, my blood-soaked hair resting on my chin, I could taste the metallic taste of my blood, coupled with a bitter, antiseptic taste. What was this? The aroma made my head spin. Feeling the stinging cold of the air on my exposed flesh, I watched while he paused, the tip of the knife away from my sight. I tried to beg him to stop, only to see him writing something on the wall, only for him to go back to his slow, agonizing slicing. All I could do was wait until he finished, hope he would leave me alone, and just let me live. Drifting in and out of consciousness, I finally woke up, my eyes still fogged over and straining my eyes to see, seeing only the shadowy shapes of my furniture in a familiar one that was now a place of horrors. Finally, my eyes cleared enough to see what was written on the wall. Written there, in my blood, was, "Thank you for the fresh moss." His face disappeared, and I couldn't see him. Pausing and listening, hoping he had taken whatever he wanted and left already. Curling my fingers, they were stiff but finally able to move. Driven by survival, pulling myself up, and with my legs like jelly, falling flat on my face on the floor, and struggling to crawl to get my bag. Only now realizing that my legs had been cut at the Achilles tendons. Not enough to kill me outright, but enough to slow my progress, or cause me to bleed out. Scraping along my hands and my belly toward my handbag, knowing it brought safety in opening it. I couldn't dial 000, the emergency number in my country. Everything had been deleted or disabled. No matter how many times I tried, it didn't work, all except for some pictures. 4, to be precise. 1. My front door with the mask I brought, and the message written in fake blood. 2. A photograph of my sleeping body with a half-eaten tray on my lap. 3. My skinned face with my unconscious body. My hand trembled from fear, blood loss, and a dark knowing of what was to come. My eyes caught sight of it, and my fears were confirmed. Finally, the 4th. His face wearing mine. Happy Halloween.
I'm from Victoria, Australia, and when I was little, I lived in a small town with my 3 sisters, one of which was my twin. Not that it's important, but it adds context. My mother was also with us, but she and my father were divorced, so it was just us. My father has always stood by his encounters, of which he believes to be a ghost. He lived there for a very short time before he and my mother split, so he had very few experiences to regale me with. One night, he was sleeping next to my mother, and he kept hearing her whisper, and it was bothering him, as he had to get up early for work, so he told her to be quiet and let him sleep. A few moments later, he felt her right next to his ear, and her breath brushed his earlobe, and he turned over in frustration, ready to tell her off. But his mouth remained open, as she was dead asleep and silent, as still as the pillow she lay. He was stunned, and when he asked her about it the next morning, she had no idea what he was talking about. Another time, when we were all young, he had put me and my sisters all to bed and sat out in the living room and watched the TV. Then a little while later, he heard running up and down the hallway. He assumed it was us mucking about and not staying in our beds, so he got up and walked up the hallway to our shared bedroom and saw we were all fast asleep. We were little children and definitely would not be convincing actors, as he knew we were definitely asleep. A chill went up his spine, and he kept running up the hallway, and every time he checked, we hadn't moved a muscle. One thing I remember is waking up to the feeling of being shoved out of bed. I recall feeling pushed very hard out of my single bed, so hard I actually landed a few feet away, and my side hurt when I got back up. Of course, being a child, I didn't even know what a ghost was, but I was certainly confused, but went back to sleep, as my sisters were asleep, and there was no one there to have possibly shoved me out of bed in the middle of the night. Years later, in a completely different house in a different town my family and I moved to, I had heard the story that a man hung himself in the shed outside. That was creepy enough, but I had no choice. From the very first night I stayed there, I felt a feeling of dread, and like I was being watched. I felt extremely uncomfortable. Most nights, all of us heard the shed door banging all throughout the night, even though it was shut. So my mother placed a large rock in the front of the door, so it couldn't bang against the metal of the shed. But somehow it still created loud bangs every night. My mother was not a very responsible mother, and I would be left on my own a lot in this house when she and my sisters went out. I always felt a little scared, but I had our 2 terriers with me to keep me company. One winter night it was freezing, and the house had no central heating. I was 13 at this point, and had watched my mother light fires multiple times, so I took it upon myself to get a roaring fire going in the fireplace. I was quite proud of my effort, and the living room heated up nicely, and I watched TV and sat there most of the night. My bedroom was freezing, so I decided to drag my mattress out and sleep in the living room where it was warm. I laid down with my eyes closed and tried to fall asleep, but I had that feeling of being watched. I tossed and turned on the mattress and patted my dog that was next to me. It was all silent besides the crackling fire. The light orange glow illuminated the room as a soft yellow, and I looked up at the ceiling to try and lull myself to sleep. I shut my eyes again when suddenly I heard footsteps coming from the left of me, all the way near the front door, which was about 7 meters away. I froze on the spot after looking towards the door and saw no one, but I still heard footsteps that then turned into running. The room was darker now, as the firelight started to dim. The footsteps were so clear, it was as if they were right next to my head. They ran towards me and I grabbed my dog and rolled over in fear, and clutched my dog with a fierce need of protection. Nothing happened. It sounded like they ran right up to me and then just disappeared. I was petrified. My chest quickly moved, and I could hear my heart thrumming quickly in my head. I wasted no time and grabbed my mattress and dragged back to my bedroom and made my bed and shut my bedroom door and laid in it. I had no cell to call my mother, so I had to put up with the fear. Half hour after settling down in bed, I started to calm down. That was until I noticed my dog sitting at the end of the bed with his ears pricked up and his posture very stiff and his head cocked, like he could hear or see something. I heard my door creak open and my dog started growling. I yelled at my dog to shut up and huddled up in the blankets. I heard my door creak again and knew it was open. My dog's head followed something I couldn't see. I ignored my fear and screamed to nothing, "Leave me alone!" And I ran to my door, which I suspected open. I had no idea how it was open when I shut it. I slammed it shut, ran to my bed, grabbed my dog and held him close. And after what felt like hours, did I fall asleep. Nothing happened after that, but the shed door still slammed every night, and nothing we did stop it. I also have a younger cousin who was extremely close to my great-grandmother who died when she was barely a year old. My nana loved her very much, but my younger cousin was seen talking and laughing by herself and talking to no one. Well, at least, no one you could see. She was a toddler when she was asked who she was talking to, and she'd say, "Nana Duncan." This would creep her parents out no end. It happened in the back of cars, and she'd also claimed to be talking to my great-grandfather, who she'd never met, as he sadly died a long time before she was born. She would say, "Poppy Duncan," and say, "He says he misses you." This would happen quite often, and my whole family believes my great-grandparents visit her after their physical selves have left. Another creepy thing involving this same cousin was my father sleeping downstairs at my grandparents' house. The second story was underground like a basement, but it was just another living room with an ensuite. My father had a nightmare in that room, that it was covered in snakes. He woke up and didn't mention it to anyone, as it was unimportant to anything. Later that day, my cousin visited her parents. She turned to my father and pointed downstairs and said, "There's snakes down there, aren't there?" she said with a laugh. This shook my dad. He told my grandparents what happened, and they were all baffled on how the young girl knew what he had dreamed of, or was it just a mere coincidence? I don't believe it was. These are mine and my family's strange experiences. I have no idea what to even call my young cousin, but it's certainly creepy.
I gotta type this out. The people out there don't want to listen to the full story about what happened. They just want to focus on that one part. They're the type of people who flip to the end of the mystery novel to make sure that their theory was correct. They're the type of people who would love to talk about what they would do in a situation, but hate to listen to one's experience. I'm writing this because I want someone to understand. Those people want to condemn me, screaming, "How could you?" And my response? I only did what I had to do. Doesn't seem to satiate them. I have to explain myself and be heard. I guess that's why I'm typing this. I can already see that this is going to take a while. I am only allowed 1 hour of time with the computers before the guards shove me back into my cell. And for the sake of honesty, I will confess that I am typing this from a correctional facility. I am not incarcerated yet. I am waiting to be tried, and from the disdainful looks that I have earned from the jury, I have no delusions as to the nature of the verdict. My daily 1 hour limit on the computer time is really going to prolong this. But after all, the trial is going to take a while due to the media circus that this case has generated, so I do have some time. I'm also writing this because I am quite lonely. The guards want nothing to do with me, and I have been placed in isolation until the hearing is over. I am alone here, and I am put in solitary when my multimedia time is up. There has been some speculation as to why this is. The court reasoned that it was for my safety. I could believe that if I hadn't seen the way that they look at me. They want me isolated due to their disgust at my appearance and my actions. Ever since the accident, I have had this ghoulish appearance, which I don't feel much like talking about, and since there are no mirrors, I really don't have to confront the damage done to my body. I'll start at the beginning. I wanted a new start. I wanted to get away. I packed my belongings, which was not a whole lot, into 2 suitcases and hopped a cross-country flight towards Colorado. I was in a rut in my home state. I'm going to gloss over the reservation in which I was born. I don't really consider it all to be part of my heritage. I wanted a fresh start and a new experience. I watched the snow fall outside the window and thought of my dreams. And I was granted that a fresh start and a new beginning by laughing and cruel gods. The engine stalled mid-flight. The place fell out of the sky. And collided with a mountain. The impact should have killed us instantly, but the pilot had attempted a breech landing. We had slammed through the trees that tore the plane apart, and we came to a skidding stop amongst the snow. I unbuckled my seatbelt and I tried to stand up. Everything had looked blurry, and I took my first tentative step. And I fell flat on my face, and I would have broken my nose had something not shielded me from the floor of the plane. My hazy vision returned to me in patches, and I recognized that I had collapsed on someone.
Hey, I'm
I began to apologize profusely as my vision cleared, and I realized that my apologies were falling on deaf ears. The dead are unable to hear. The man, what remained of him, had been horizontally bisected by his seatbelt and laid in 2 messy pieces on the cabin floor. His death was a quick one. He bled out in seconds, while others filled the air with their whimpering and supplications to gods who were no longer listening. The first thing I did was move around the plane and check on the other passengers. Most were obtunded and looked like they would never wake up due to their injuries. I guess I was lucky that I was in the middle of the plane and I wasn't whipped around as badly as the others in the crash. Most of the passengers were lost causes. One woman had been lashed forward into the fold-down tray, which had pierced her neck and killed her relatively quickly. I stepped onto something firm that gave under my foot, and desperately tried to continue onwards, trying not to focus on the lack of response or how their tiny shoe looked sticking out from the darkness from under the seats. I saw more carnage. The most gruesome instance that I can recall was the stewardess. She had been helping passengers into their seats while the plane went down. She didn't have time to get to safety as the food cart bore down on her and smashed her into the cargo door. I could only tell the remains were a stewardess by her name tag that read Marge Reed. She was a red, splattered mess that was sprayed against the door to the cargo, her exposed ribcage jutting out of her ruptured abdomen like a macabre spider that sought to ensnare me. I would have thrown up had I not been in such a shocked state. I moved up towards the cockpit, checking on the other passengers who might have survived. I passed more dying and dead people. One arrested my progress. It was a man. He was dressed in a jacket with a tie, the business type. He groaned in pain. He pawed feebly at the metal protrusion in his chest. Upon closer examination, I learned that it was the metal part of the seat tray that had impaled him into the seat. It must have missed his heart, but judging by his rasping breaths, I knew it had probably pierced and deflated a lung. He was dead. He just didn't know it yet. And the impaled man pled.
Help me. It hurts.
His hand clawed at the metal bar as he coughed up a watery red substance. I responded. You're dying. His eyes dilated and he whimpered.
I'm cold.
I nodded and I braced myself. I told him to close his eyes, and when he did, I pressed the palm of my hand over his mouth and I pinched his nose shut. He shifted in his seat and tore the wound in his chest deeper. My hand held fast to his mouth and nose as I gave him the only mercy that was left to give. I held my hand over his mouth for a few moments longer until I was sure. And once I knew that he was dead, I threw up in the aisle. and I continued up the aisle. Most of the other passengers were beyond help, but their end was a fast approaching and merciful thing. They had only minutes left as opposed to the impaled man who might have lived through his injuries for a few agonizing hours before finally giving up the ghost. I kept telling myself that, and that's why I couldn't help them. Couldn't bring myself to do that again. I knew that if I did, something inside me would break and I would be just as dead as that man. The door to the cockpit was stuck. I rammed my shoulder into it a few more times before it gave way enough for me to look in. And I did not like what I saw. The nose of the plane had collided with the side of the mountain and the cockpit had taken the brunt of the damage. It had crumpled like it had been in the hands of an angry god. And through the wreckage, I could see only a few things to confirm that there had actually been someone in the cockpit. One of which was a hand sticking out of the crumpled metal. It twitched spasmodically, and I lied to myself and I said that it was the electricity from the sparking equipment galvanizing the body. I returned to the cabin of the plane, unwilling to stay as a witness to the gruesome scene before me. It was as I started down the airplane aisle again that I first became aware of the cold. It cut through to my core and it sent me shivering. I looked to my right and I noticed that there was a massive ragged hole in the side of the plane where the wing had once been attached. The cold air was blowing in and throwing a few wayward snowflakes into the aisles. A sound snapped my head up towards the back of the plane. Someone was in the lavatory, but the food cart was blocking the exit and trapping them inside. I pulled the cart aside, wincing as the wheels dragged through the messy remains of Marge. The man hobbled out of the bathroom. He had a few bruises and bumps, but he was going to survive. He walked with a limp, which made me assume that he had pulled something or injured himself in the crash. He introduced himself as Jim, and as I was about to give him my name, a shout of surprise interrupted me.
Hey!
There was another survivor. The other survivor, who only addressed himself as Tamsin, had just regained consciousness next to the corpse of another passenger. We managed to wrestle him out of the seat, and Jim slapped some sense back into him. We each rehashed the story of the crash as if retelling it would change the outcome. Tamsin swore that we had hit something, and Jim proposed that the engine had froze over due to the unnatural cold. It was at that suggestion that the thought dawned on us that we could freeze if we didn't do something about the cold. We began pulling luggage from the overhead and blocking up the gaping hole of the side of the plane. This did help to prevent some of the cold air from blowing into the plane and kept the predators out. And the sudden onset of adrenaline that we each experienced at the start of the crash had ebbed, and we were just now innervated. We spent the first night huddled together for warmth in the aisles, surrounded by the dead, and while the wind howled at us through the wreckage of our plane. And that night I dreamt of the pilot's hand sticking out of the wreckage, and it twitched to life and it began to beckon me with its fingers as if inviting me somewhere. And I didn't sleep so well for the rest of the night. We had raided the food cart and ate chips while discussing our plans. I knew that the airport would know something went wrong when we didn't arrive and they would come for us. Tamsin disagreed and pushed us to leave the wreckage and seek salvation. Jim opposed this, and that's when Tamsin became agitated. Tamsin told us that he wasn't going to stay in the steel coffin to freeze and starve to death, and that he was going to leave and find help. I was about to point out the ridiculousness of venturing outside without protection against the elements, when Tamsin put his plan into motion. He began stripping the dead of their clothes and wrapping them around himself. He made an effective coat against the snow. He had wished us luck before venturing outside with nothing but a bag of airplane chips, a bottle of water, and his makeshift coat. I never saw Tamsin again after that. I would later find out why Jim was against the idea of walking to freedom. In the plane crash, he had injured his leg. He had rolled it and dislocated his ankle. By the end of that day, his ankle was swollen to the size of a softball, and the slightest movement was agonizing. The shock of yesterday had covered the pain, and now the adrenaline was gone. He was effectively disabled. It all fell on me to care for him and try to survive. I took advantage of Tamsin's idea and undressed the rest of the corpses to fashion a makeshift coat for Jim and me. I began then the less than pleasant task of moving the corpses back into the cargo hold. The hardest part of that job was dealing with Marge's corpse. I was almost afraid to touch her body because she looked like one of those monsters from John Carpenter's The Thing. While I dragged the 57 deceased passengers into the cargo hold, Jim was taking stock of the food and water, and when I finished, he told me the news that I already knew. We had enough food for about 2 more days. We had crashed after an in-flight service and the reservations were depleted. And at the end of the 3rd day, we were out of food. During those days, we speculated about how far off our rescue was. Jim told me that they were only a few days away. But I knew better. If they hadn't found us for 3 days, they had no clue where we were and the search would take weeks. In my darker moments, I wished that I had joined Tamsin and abandoned Jim. It would have been a lot quicker, one way or another. After depleting our stock of food, our discussions began to grow darker. He spoke of death and the hopelessness of our situation. I knew that Jim's ankle had now swollen to the size of a grapefruit and hurt him so badly that he was drinking his way through the plane's minibar to ease the pain. The alcohol self-medicated him, but it made him have to use the lavatory frequently. I had to help him up, which hurt his leg and made him want to drink more. It was a vicious cycle. When he was drunk one night, he told me that we had to survive one way or another. He proceeded to suggest that we eat the corpses of the other deceased passengers. And by then, a week had passed without food and my stomach was filled with a dull hurt. I told Jim that the thought was insane, and I waited until he passed out before I snuck back to the cargo to examine the corpses. They were practically naked, save for the underwear, and their skin was covered in frost and frozen from the condensation that formed on their bodies, thawing and unthawing in the hold. They had begun to rot. There was no way that we could eat them without getting sick. The smell of the decomposed bodies was so pungent that I almost threw up. The cargo hold was not insulated like the main cabin of the plane, so its temperature fluctuated more wildly as the sun rose and scorched the plane's skin during the day. And the moon gazed silently at the night's cold tendrils coiled through the insulated section. When I returned to the little nest of clothes that I had made, Jim was awake. He read my expression.
They're rotten.
I told him that we couldn't eat them and that we would just have to wait for rescue. He had laughed at that. And he laughed maniacally for the rest of the day. Desperation began to set in the next couple of days. Time was a relative thing. I began to lose count of the days that we'd been stranded out there on the mountain range. Jim drifted in and out of delirium as the pain in his dislocated ankle grew greater with every passing moment. He had moments of clarity where he was able to form coherent sentences and befuddled moments where he only laughed or wept for hours. I retreated to myself as the hunger slowly began to eat me from the inside out. The jury wants to know when I made my fiendish decision, how I came to it. I can't give an exact time or sentiment. The days had settled into a dull malaise, and the nights had contorted into a nightmarish phantasms of hands writhing in wreckage and rib cages closing around me like teeth. But I felt nothing. I existed in a semi-consciousness stupefied state. All I can tell you is that before I did what I did, I lifted up the slat and I looked at the frozen landscape. No one was out there, and I was all alone. I had made my decision. I drank a tiny bottle of Jack Daniels to steel myself. I slammed the bottle on the armrest and it broke into a sharp edge. And I turned to Jim, who had shifted into a state of uncontrollable laughter. I had tried to talk to him for days, but he just kept laughing and shrieking nonsense. I had no other choice. I stabbed him in the throat, and the mini bottle cracked as it pierced him. Blood welled up on the surface, but it hadn't penetrated deep enough to be a fatal wound. Having lost the weapon, I straddled and I began choking him. He had resisted feebly, his hands beating at me, but was wrapped in clothing and barely felt it. It took him 5 minutes to die. I continued to choke him until I was sure that he was dead. His eyes rolled back in his head and his struggling stopped. I kept strangling him for a few minutes to be sure. I throttled him and I shook him until his neck gave a sickening snap. And I placed my head over his chest and listened for his heartbeat. I heard nothing. He was dead. Once I was certain that he was gone, I rolled off of his chest and I threw up bile. I was hunched over on the ground, and I wept bitter tears into the bile. There was nothing left of any substance in my stomach to begin with, but I knew that I was about to fit into the most macabre way possible. My hunger overtook me. I knelt to his open wound and I placed my lips over it. The feeling of having something warm after what felt like an eternity of living in the frigid environment coursing down my throat filled me with such vigor. Once I had quenched myself of the copper and crimson elixir, I set to the grisly task of separating the flesh from bone. I had nothing to aid my task but my hands and teeth. I tore the flesh of my friend off in hunks with my teeth. I won't describe it in any more detail, as I've already done. I am ashamed of it, but if put in the same situation all over again, I would do the exact same thing. After eating Jim, who had been my only source of companionship in the desolate ruins of the plain, I lost all semblance of sanity. I drifted. No, I divorced myself from reality. I returned to a sort of primal state. I was a feral and fiendish creature. I don't know how much time had passed while I was in that primordial state. I don't know if days or weeks had elapsed since I consumed my friend before help finally arrived. I only know the circumstances in which my rescuers found me. Judging from their witness testimony, they breached the plane through the massive hole in the side. They had to tear out the luggage barricade that we had erected. At first, the search and rescue team thought there were no survivors. They did a search of the aisles and found nothing. That was when they moved into the cargo hold that they found me and the other passengers. The cargo hold was dark. They couldn't see anything, so they used their flashlights. Before they could switch them on, many attested to having heard a sickening crack. And they finally trained their lights on me. I had just broken open the bone of one of my fellow deceased passengers. My mouth was firmly attached to the woman's fractured femur, and I was trying to suck out the marrow of it. The light startled me out of my state. At first, I thought the light from their flashlights was a product of my fevered dreams. It was only until I looked at them and into their faces that I knew that I wasn't hallucinating. They looked at me in a mixture of shock, terror, and disgust as having seen me at my most human state. They weren't sure if I was a monster or a man, and I'm not sure of that myself. I don't know how long I had been in the cargo hold, but I am aware of a few things. At some point, I stripped off my makeshift coat. I must have been in the cargo hold for at least a couple of days, feeding off of the marrow of the other passengers' corpses. The cargo was not insulated. It was so cold in there at times, but I couldn't leave. It was nice, dark, and comfortable. They took me back to civilization, a shell of my former self. My first concrete memory of being back in civilization was when I first caught sight of the monster. They had put me up in a hotel for the night while they decided what to do with me. They wanted to charge me with murder and desecration. I couldn't think of anything else to do, so I paced my room for hours. And it was in this boredom that I first caught sight of the monster that plagues me to this very day. It was fiendish and grotesque thing. Its nose and fingertips were black, and there was a feral knife-sliced grin plastered across its face. One that made it look almost as manic as Jim. It was gaunt and emaciated. And I wanted to scream, but I was paralyzed. It took me a few moments before I realized that the monster that I had seen was my reflection. I recall something that Ellie Weissel wrote. From the depths of the mirror, a corpse gazed back at me. The look in his eyes, as they stared at mine, have never left. I stared at the fiend transfixed for hours. I couldn't tell who or what had survived the plane crash. And this is my story. This will be my last day in here. Tomorrow morning I will be gone. The image of the jury standing and declaring me innocent of murder is burned in my mind. And he stood there and said, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Canonis, Mr. Blackwood, to be innocent due to extenuating and debilitating circumstances. Tomorrow I will be released back into the world. To be truthful, I am ambivalent about the verdict. I'm not sure if I should be released back into the world. A part of me yearns to be free, and another part of me demands that I be caged. Every night, I wake with a scream trapped in my throat, and the salty and iron-esque taste of marrow is fresh in my mouth. And I don't know what's worse. The memory dream, or how my stomach growls as I can almost taste the copper and sickly sweetness. It sounds crazy, right? I know it's crazy. That is why I am going to erase this. All of this. Even if I decide to delete this entire thing. I'm glad that I told it. I'm glad to get this off of my chest. The prison guard sank into the chair with an over-exaggerated sigh. He was glad to see the freaky-looking man leave. Trial was over, but the media shitstorm still swirled around them. The news stations were clamoring for evidence, and he glanced back and forth to make sure that there were no witnesses before he began. He turned on the computer and he began searching for any relevant data Blackwood might have left behind. Anything. A letter or an email to family or friends would fetch a high price for them. The guard found no email, but he did manage to recover a document that had been deleted hours before Blackwood was released back into the world. The prison guard leaned forward and began to read the document with a hungry expression on his face. This would fetch a high price. Indeed.
It was a different time with regards to trick-or-treating nowadays. Today there is a much more controlled and monitored environment. I was born in the 70s and grew up in the 80s and 90s. Things were a lot more easygoing back then. The first few times I went out, I was very young and went with my parents. But by the time I was 12, I had been out several times with just my siblings. However, when I was 12, I just went out with my friends from school. Of course, this was around the time when we liked getting the candy, but we weren't very entertained by just trick-or-treating. You get 3 12-year-old boys going out in the dark without any parental supervision, and they would likely be tempted by mischievous behavior. We decided to sneak into the more affluent part of the neighborhood. These were the big, expensive houses, and in our town, they never did anything for Halloween. So we thought we would go and play some tricks on them, since they were too stingy to have treats for everyone. I can't say that I remember everything that we did. However, most of it was just ding-dong ditch. Although it worked out a few times, more often than not, no one would come to the door. I think many of the families weren't even home, and our misadventures through the neighborhood got pretty old, pretty fast. Me and one of my friends, Michael, suggested that we go to this house that was on a dead-end street. As far as anyone knew, the house had been unoccupied for a long time. We thought that maybe we could get a good Halloween scare at the house, since it was pretty well thought of as a haunted house. When we got there, we began daring each other to go up and ring the doorbell. I can admit that I was definitely too scared to. But when you're that age and you're afraid, you just challenge your friends to do something worse than they were daring you to do. Eventually we got Michael to go up and see if he could break into the front door. I could tell he was terrified, but he didn't have any way to come back at me. So as my other friends and I stood at the end of the walkway to the front porch, we watched as Michael slowly began walking up to the door. My other friend, Ben, turned to me at one point and whispered, "Hey, did you see that?" When I asked him what he was talking about, he pointed to the front window that was maybe about 10 feet away from the door. For just a moment I saw a light in the corner of the window. It was there for just a split second before it disappeared. I was about to call out to Michael, but Ben shushed me. He had a huge grin on his face, and I could tell he was expecting Michael to just get the scare of his life. At the moment, I thought it was a good idea too. Michael began messing with the doorknob of the front door. He jerked it back and forth a few times, and nothing happened. But then, while he continued to do it, the door suddenly opened right up. He nearly fell into the house. It took us a moment to realize that someone had unlocked the door from the inside and pulled it open. I had no idea who the guy was who opened the door, but he looked like he might have been 17 years old. He was wearing dark clothing, and it was pretty dark too, so I couldn't see him well beyond that. None of that mattered, however. He had Michael by the wrist and was trying to pull him into the house. Michael began screaming and trying to pull away. Ben and I began running up to the door until the guy holding Michael raised his other hand up. At that moment we saw that he had a pocket knife in his hand, and he immediately put it to Michael's neck. That caused both Ben and I to stop dead in our tracks. He held the point of the knife up against Michael's neck and pressed it a little bit. He then whispered something into Michael's ear, and we could all hear Michael begin to sob a little bit. The three of us had never been so scared in our lives. Finally, after what seemed like forever, the teenager took Michael and threw him to the ground. He then went back into the house and closed the door behind him. Michael immediately got up and ran over to us. We took off down the street, trying to get as far away from that house as we can. When we finally rested, we asked Michael what had happened. He was pretty inconsolable, but he told me the guy whispered in his ear, "If you tell anyone we're here, I'll cut your neck open and drink your blood." Needless to say, we didn't tell anyone what happened. However, we later in life found out who the teen was. His name was Cedric, and he spent a lot of time in juvie for getting into fights. He actually didn't live in the house, but went there with his friends to do drugs. Last I heard about him, he went to jail for an attempted murder. When I found out about that, I realized how much danger we had actually been in that night.
Want to get high tonight? Scott was bordering on junkie status, and I was always wary about spending time with him. Normally in the filthy apartment of some dealer friend while he shot up. It seemed like he was bordering on a collapse, and I was scared of doing the same. I don't know, what are you thinking? On the other hand, I had been despondent since breaking up with Ruth. Maybe something to take my mind off the pain would help. I knew she was better off without me, and that I was just holding her back. Meet me at Jared's. He said he wants to try something new. This made me feel a little better. Jared was probably the nicest dealer Scott knew, and his stuff was generally sourced well, plus his apartment was at least somewhat clean. You know I don't fuck with needles. Yeah man, it's fine, it's nothing like that. I showed up at 8 with 3 beers in my system that had failed to calm the nervous energy I was feeling. Whatever, it's fine. It's going to be fine, I told myself. Jared was happy to see me and poured me a whiskey. I felt a little weird and sat down at the table. He put down 3 black pills in front of us. I got this from a trusted contact overseas, he began. Said it's like something else. Thought the three of us could test it before I put in an order. See if it's really worth it. Stuff is called Forever. Scott laughed and downed a pill. Jared and I followed suit. I sat down and stared at the TV, waiting for it to kick in. It was fine, and I felt really mellow. And sort of like the room, and me with it, was stretching in a weird way. We all wound up falling asleep. I woke up the next day feeling fine, and we parted ways. No big deal, but certainly nothing life-changing either. Years passed, never left town, never really did anything. Could never kick smoking cigarettes either. Wasn't a surprise when the doc told me the blood I was coughing up was cancer. Shit. It was too late to do anything though, and I was alone when I took my last breath. I woke up back in Jared's apartment, sun streaming through the window. What the fuck? I hallucinated an entire sad life. What was that drug? I mumbled something at Jared and Scott and walked outside. What a weird dream. I decided I could do more. Maybe that was a wake-up call. I applied to a job I didn't think I was qualified for, and I got it. I stopped screwing around, quit smoking, married a nice girl, had a kid who loved to play basketball outside. He didn't even see the truck coming the day he chased his ball into the street. But I did. Probably never moved that fast in my life. Fast enough to push him out of the way, but not fast enough to get myself out of the way. Oh well, what a way to go, protecting someone you love. Again, I woke up in Jared's apartment. Fuck me, what the hell was happening? I had to short-circuit this. I must still be tripping. I decided to throw myself off the bridge down the street. When I got there, I found I physically couldn't do it. Something stopped me. So killing myself was out of it. I had to go home and figure this out. I wasn't paying attention as I walked up the stairs to my apartment. If I had, I would have noticed the neighbor's kid had left a toy car on one of them. When I slipped and tumbled, I knew it was going to be bad. And once again, I woke up in Jared's apartment. Maybe this could be fun. However long this lasts, I can do anything. And it's not real. It's like lucid dreaming, but it lasts for decades. I tried a life of crime. Got shot coming out of an electronics store. Not cut out for that, and it hurt like hell. I screwed around and partied too much. And overdosed. I lived 10 or 12 lifetimes when I saw her. Ruth. It might seem weird to have forgotten her, but you have to remember we had broken up nearly 300 years before this. She was older, divorced, sad. She married the wrong guy after our breakup and got abused for years. I was so depressed after our talk, I just walked for hours thinking about how sad her life had turned out. I thought I was helping her. I found myself in a rough neighborhood when I got jumped and didn't hand over my wallet. That was a mistake. I woke up in Jared's apartment. This time I could fix it. I bought a bunch of flowers and went to Roos. She took me back. We got married and had a family. We traveled the world. Best friends. It was incredible. The best life I'd ever had. I died a happy old man surrounded by family. But yet again I woke up in Jared's apartment. I bought a bunch of flowers and went to Roos. If I'm stuck in this Groundhog Day shit, I know what to do. You know what isn't boring? Living the best goddamn life you can. Twice, 3 times, 10 times. The rough edges get smoothed away, and you learn when bad news is coming. When you need to sidestep a bad argument, just absolute happiness. If you get to choose happiness, you choose it. Every damn time. Then one day we were in Paris, celebrating our 30th anniversary. I'd taken this trip with her over 20 times. She walked down to the cafe to get me some breakfast. A car jumped the sidewalk and killed her. That had never happened before. The next lifetime was worse. We made it 12 years after our wedding before she got some weird flu variant and died. The next one, she was diagnosed with cancer a year after marriage. We never had kids. The next one, her building had burned down the night I spent at Jared's. I stood outside with flowers in my hand, staring at the smoking ruins. A filthy old homeless man walked up next to me as I stared in disbelief. "Thought you could cheat it, didn't you?" he said. "Thought he wouldn't notice, but he did." He started laughing as he walked away. He turned back from time to time to smile at me. My lives turned dark. Friends were killed in horrible accidents. Serial killers struck peaceful towns and ravaged families of those I loved. Overdose, disease, murder, death. Everything was wrong. The world turned too. Dictators came to power. Wars broke out. Hatred rose. Cities burned. Countries shattered. The world bled. The old man would appear from time to time, though centuries would sometimes pass between sightings. He always laughed at me, told me that he had me now, always smiled at me. I drifted from one dying port town to the next, finding work where I could, drinking away shitty lifetime after shitty lifetime. I was sitting in a bar in the capital of East Scotland, watching some cable news about a genocide in some country that hadn't even existed in most of my lifetimes. The bartender laughed and I looked at him clearly for the first time. It was the old man, and as always, he smiled at me. "Who the fuck are you?" I growled. "He sees you now. Where do I go to find him?" He laughed. "Go to Samar in the Philippines. Not now though, in your next life, when you're still young. Find Birrigan. He waits for you there." He smiled at me and I stumbled for the door. I lived another dozen years before a boat I was on went down in a storm. Yet again I woke up in Jared's dusty apartment. This time I immediately started looking for a way to get to the Philippines. I sold my car and walked to work for 6 months, eating the cheapest food I could find. I arrived confused. Turns out Birrigan isn't a real place. Or maybe it is. I found work under the table, making money however I could. I asked about the invisible city of local folklore. I asked questions about the lore behind it, and I learned that the many people who had seen it were victims of demonic possession. I searched for it every chance I got. Years passed by. I lived an invisible life, like the invisible city I sought. The world rotted away, but I still searched. One night I was walking home and a car stopped next to me. I heard a familiar laugh through the window. I looked up and saw the old man. He smiled at me and I got in the car. We drove for hours. The gas gauge never moved. Finally, in the distance, I saw a gleaming city of light. He pulled over and gestured me. "You have to walk from here. He is waiting for you in the center of the city." He smiled and then drove away. I got out and walked. It felt like I walked for days, but the sun never came up, and I never grew thirsty. I walked into a gleaming, deserted city. I felt drawn to a giant tower in the center of the city. It glowed with a light despite having no windows or obvious source of illumination. I was not surprised to find a single door at the bottom of the tower. I entered and began to climb. As I went, I heard a voice, deep and old. I couldn't make out the words. I climbed forever, finally reaching a door. I opened it and stepped inside, facing a giant black abyss. The voice was everywhere now. Every word ripped me apart.
"I watched you cheat me. Did you think you could live your lies forever?"
I screamed.
"You're with me now, forever. I destroyed this world."
The abyss closed and I realized I was staring at a giant mouth. It opened again. I thought of Ruth and the world went black. I woke up in the hospital. Scott jumped up from the chair in the corner. "Oh, dude, I'm so glad you're awake. What happened?" He looked over his shoulder. "We were just about to take those pills and you threw up all over them and collapsed. You had a crazy fever." I looked around. "How long have I been out?" 4 days. Ruth keeps chasing me out of here, thinks I did this." He glanced at his shoes. Nurses don't like me much either. Why is Ruth here? She's your emergency contact, dude. Hasn't left your side even to go home and sleep. She's just getting coffee now. He paused and shifted awkwardly. Do you have any cash? Jared is kind of pissed you puked on all the stuff. I heard an excited shriek and barely managed to turn my head as Ruth launched herself at me. I was in the hospital for another 4 days before getting discharged. Doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with me. Said it must have been a freak infection. Getting discharged was great. Ruth was picking me up and bringing me to Scott's so I could go with him to their first NA meeting. Seeing me almost died scared him, and he was trying to straighten himself out. Then Ruth and I had a special date planned. Things were getting figured out. We were thrilled for another chance. I walked out to the curb and waited for Ruth to pull her car around. I stood there in the sunlight, feeling alive for the first time in, I guess, a millennia. A nurse rolled another patient in a wheelchair out to the curb and walked back inside. I felt the breeze on my face and smiled. The old man in the wheelchair laughed. I stared at him and he winked. He let you go, but make sure he doesn't get his teeth into you again. Then he smiled at me. And this time, I smiled back.